That day it wasn't the sound of the trigger that sent chills down the spine. It was the silence just before it. Jesse James had his rifle raised. Across from him, an Apache stood still, motionless. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stared. There, in the heart of the desert, two men who were never meant to meet faced each other like old enemies with unfinished business. And in the second before the shot, Jesse hesitated, because in that gaze, there was something he'd seen before. The look of a man who had lost everything, of honor that never kneels. And it was there, in that suspended moment, that the past returned like a soundless bullet. But before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. His name drifted across the country like dust on the wind. Jesse Woodson James. To some, he was a thief. To others, a hero. But those who truly knew him knew he was something else. He was a ghost, born in Clay County, Missouri in 1847, son of a preacher who left for California chasing gold and never came back. By 15, the war had swallowed everything, his home, his peace, his childhood. Missouri became no man's land, and Jesse became part of it. Union soldiers stormed the James family farm, tied up his half-brother, beat his mother until she lost part of her hand. Jesse watched. He never forgot. He never forgave. By 16, he rode with Quantrill's raiders, Confederate guerrillas who answered to no flag, only to revenge. You didn't follow orders in that gang. You followed blood. Jesse learned fast, learned to shoot without blinking, to vanish into the brush like smoke, to ride hard, strike faster, and trust no man. He wasn't fighting for the South. He was fighting for the pain in his gut and the voices in his past. And every bullet he fired carried a name. By the time the war ended, Jesse James didn't come home, because there was no home left to return to. The fields were burnt, the house half collapsed, the soil soaked with too many stories no one dared to tell. But Jesse wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He traded his uniform for a wide-brimmed hat and started riding under a different banner, one with no colors, only fire. Together with his brother Frank and a tight band of former Confederates, Jesse turned his sights on a new enemy, the banks, the railroads, the iron giants that swallowed land and spat out silence. To him, they were just the next version of the Union, suits instead of uniforms, greed instead of guns. Their first job? Clay County Savings Association, 1866. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a statement, broad daylight, no masks, 2 men dead, and Jesse's name left behind like a shadow on the vault door. From there, the legend ignited. Train by train, bank by bank, Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, Pinkerton agents on their trail, breathing down their necks like wolves in the dark. But Jesse, he didn't run, he provoked. He sent letters to newspapers, called himself a soldier of the people, said he was fighting for the ones forgotten by the new America, and people believed it. Farmers whispered his name like a prayer. Mothers told their sons stories of the outlaw who stood against the machine. But behind every tale, every gunfight, every gallop into the dusk, Jesse grew harder, colder, like the war never ended, like it had followed him and was still pulling the trigger through his hand. He laughed less, slept less, trusted no one, because Jesse knew, in this new world of steel and smoke, a man like him had no place, unless he carved one with blood. It was the summer of 1879 when Jesse James crossed into Arizona territory, chasing a whisper, not a target. Word had reached him through a broken letter, passed hand to hand, across rail towns and saloons. A Union officer, long thought dead, was living under a new name in the desert. A man Jesse had been hunting since the war, the one who ordered the burning of Lawrence, the one who smiled while mothers screamed. Jesse didn't speak a word to Frank, didn't say goodbye to his wife, Zerelda, just mounted his horse, tipped his hat low and rode west. What he didn't know was that someone else was riding east. Tashunka, Apache by blood, son of a shaman, and the last survivor of a village no one dared name aloud. He had no letters, no wanted posters, no gang, just a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, and a memory that bled every time the wind shifted. Tashunka had seen white riders come and go, missionaries, soldiers, surveyors with maps, but the one he was looking for had a name he never forgot, James. James. He didn't know the face, only the fire, only the aftermath. Somewhere, between the Sonoran plains and the bones of ancient trails, these two men, molded by hate, grief and silence, were being pulled toward each other, not by chance, not by justice, but by something deeper, a wound that stretched across generations, and a truth buried beneath the ashes of both their homes. Because in the red dust of Arizona, Jesse wasn't the only one hunting ghosts. He was born under a blood moon, in a land where the rocks remembered things men had long tried to forget. His name, Tashunka, meant horse spirit, but there was nothing wild in his gaze, only stillness, a kind of silence that unnerved even the elders. He wasn't the tallest, nor the strongest, but when he walked, even the coyotes listened. When he spoke, rarely, people leaned in, afraid to miss it. But after a certain night, he never spoke again. That night came when he was just 12. The blue coats came at dawn. A new settlement was going up 2 valleys over. They said the Apache had to go, said the land was needed for progress, said it with guns. Tashunka hid beneath a cedar bush and watched his entire world burn. The lodges, the sacred tree, the faces. He didn't cry, didn't move, just watched. The next morning, he walked through the ashes barefoot and never said another word. They tried to give him a new name, a Christian one. He refused. He lived among other scattered bands, trading skills for shelter. But his eyes were always somewhere else, always on the horizon, always listening for a sound only he seemed to hear. By 16, he could track a man by the way dust, settled on a cactus, could hunt a rabbit with nothing but a rock and patience. But what made him feared and respected was how he looked at men, like he already knew what they'd done. He carried 2 weapons, a knife, curved and worn, and a rifle, not his, but his father's, found bent and bloodied in the ashes. He never polished it, never cleaned the old burn along the barrel. He wanted it to remember. The name James reached him by accident, whispered by a merchant in a border town, a white outlaw, a killer of men, a man whose gang rode near the Union, a man who might have been there that night, might have pulled a trigger. Tashunka didn't blink. He walked into the desert without food, without water, only the rifle and the weight. And somewhere, as the horizon turned red again, the paths of 2 ghosts, one born of war, the other of fire, began to twist toward each other, not for justice, not for peace, but because pain doesn't forget. The sun hit the desert like it hated the earth. Even the lizards had taken cover. The air shimmered over the dry flats like it wanted to hide something or someone. And in that brutal stillness, a single rider moved across the heat waves, one slow hoofprint at a time. Jesse James had seen every kind of land the war had to offer: mud-drenched hills in Kentucky, frozen riverbanks in Illinois, thick woods crawling with gun smoke in Kansas. But this wasn't land. It was bone. It was memory burned to ash, and Jesse could feel something crawling beneath it, like the past itself was alive out here. He rode without his gang. No Frank, no Cole, just himself, his rifle and a saddlebag with half a flask, and the torn corner of an army map. A map with an X drawn in old ink. Beside it the name Cole Barrett, a name that hadn't been spoken in years, a name Jesse had been dreaming about since the war ended. Colonel Josiah Barrett, U.S. Army, the man who had led a massacre and called it a cleansing, who had smiled at Jesse's mother as her barn burned, who had issued the orders that made Missouri run red. And now, if the rumors were right, he was here, hiding like a rattlesnake under the Arizona dust. Jesse wiped the sweat from his neck with a bandana, eyes narrowed against the sun. There was a canyon up ahead, a narrow cut in the land where shadows held on a little longer. If Barrett was here, he'd be somewhere like that. A place where no law reached. A place where ghosts didn't need to hide. What Jesse didn't know was that another set of eyes had already spotted him. Tashunka had been following the horse prints since dawn. Wide gait, worn shoes, one hoof chipped, front left. This was no soldier, no settler. This was a rider who'd seen war and didn't care if it saw him back. From a ridge above, the Apache lay on his stomach, still as stone, rifle in hand. He didn't blink. The man down there, Jesse, wasn't just anyone. Tushunka had watched him in a saloon 2 towns over, had listened as the bartender whispered stories about the famous outlaw with iron nerves and a price on his head. But Tushunka didn't care about fame. He cared about names, and Jesse James was a name that kept circling his mother's deathbed prayers, a name tied to the blue coats by blood or by betrayal. Either way, it was a name that needed to answer. Below, Jesse dismounted slowly, leading his horse by the reins toward the canyon mouth. He paused, looking up for just a second, and that's when it happened. Not a shot, not a shout, a click, soft, deadly. Behind him, Jesse froze, raised his hands an inch from his sides, fingers twitching. Then he turned. There he was, a man standing in silence, rifle raised, wind pushing strands of black hair across his eyes, bare chest streaked with dust, scars like rivers across his skin. No badge, no gang, just one question in his eyes. Do you remember? Jesse's voice was dry, low. You gonna pull that trigger, stranger? No answer. He looked at the rifle. Not new, old, burned along the barrel. Jesse nodded once, slow. That yours or your father's? The silence cracked just a little. A muscle in Tushunka's jaw moved. Then Jesse said something strange, something a man like him had never said before. I ain't running. And he didn't reach for his gun, didn't flinch, because deep down he knew this wasn't about bounty, wasn't about gold. This was about something older than both of them. I was 16, Jesse said, voice rough, like gravel dragged across wood. Riding with Quantrill. They told us it was just a scouting mission. We came on a camp, didn't know it was Apache. They opened fire, we fired back. I lost 3 men. Tushunka didn't lower the rifle, but his grip changed. I didn't know, Jesse added. Didn't want it, but I didn't stop it neither. He looked Tushunka in the eye. Is that enough to die over? Still no answer, but something in the air shifted, like a rope pulled too tight had just given one notch of slack. Then Jesse took the risk. Name's Jesse James, and if you're hunting for ghosts, maybe we're chasing the same one. Tushunka blinked, just once. Then slowly, almost like a shadow falling back into place, he lowered the rifle. They stood there, 2 men who should have spilled each other's blood, staring, waiting, and in that canyon. Silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, because sometimes the past doesn't come at you screaming. Sometimes it walks right up and speaks your name. The fire crackled low between them, a fragile circle of light in a desert that had swallowed entire tribes whole. They hadn't said much since the canyon. Jesse had offered water. Tushunka had accepted. That was it. 2 men sitting across from each other, speaking through silence, like neither trusted words enough anymore. But the silence wasn't empty. It held questions. History, blood. Jesse leaned back against a rock, adjusting his shirt. That's when Tushunka saw it. Just a flicker, something on Jesse's left shoulder. A brand, not a scar from battle, not a burn from fire. A brand, deliberate, cruel, unmistakable. Faded now, twisted with age, but still there. Tushunka's eyes narrowed. He knew that symbol. It wasn't army, wasn't tribal. It was the mark of a camp, Fort Baker, one of the hidden ones, where prisoners weren't buried in cemeteries but in reports no one ever read. Tushunka said nothing, just stood, walked over, pointed. Jesse looked up, brow furrowed, then understood. He slowly pulled the shirt down, revealing the full mark, a circle with a slash through it, branded just below the collarbone, ugly, raw, the kind of thing you don't forget, even when you try. Jesse's voice was like dust on steel. Got that when I was 17, captured by Union scouts. Said I was a spy. Hauled me to a pit in Arkansas. No trial, no names, just days, nights, and screams. Tushunka crouched beside the fire, listening. Jesse's eyes drifted, but not to the fire, to the dark. I watched a man go mad in there. Thought he was digging a tunnel with his bare hands, just scratched till there was bone. When they came for him, he laughed. Said he was already out. Tushunka's hand went to his own shoulder. Beneath his beads and feathers, Jesse saw it. A faint, twisted scar. Not a brand. A bullet graze. Close. Too close. The kind that happens when you're running and someone wants you gone. Jesse exhaled slow. Seems we've both been marked, one way or another. For a long time, the only sound was the wind pushing through the canyon. Coyotes howled far off. Somewhere an owl called once, then went silent. Then Jesse reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in a cloth. He unrolled it carefully. A map. Old, torn at the edges, written not just in ink, but in codes, slashes, field notes. "This here's from a soldier I used to ride with. Said Barrett was moving cargo through the West after the war. Gold, supplies, but also something else. Records, names, orders they didn't want made public." Tashunka's brow tightened. He knew what Jesse meant. Documents that could name who gave the orders, who signed off on the burning of villages, the disappearances, the relocations, proof. And that meant danger. Jesse tapped the map. "There's a spot marked here, near the Salt River, an old outpost. Buried now, but if Barrett left anything, it's there." Tashunka studied the markings, then looked up, eyes sharp, questioning. "Why share this? Why trust?" Jesse shrugged, almost to himself. "Maybe because I'm tired of riding with ghosts. Maybe because if I go alone, I don't come back. Or maybe you got more right to this truth than I do." Tashunka didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. Instead, he reached into his own satchel and pulled out something unexpected, a strip of buckskin wrapped tight. He placed it on the ground between them and opened it. Inside, a single silver button, engraved, Union Army. Jesse stared at it like it might bite him. "My mother found that in my sister's hand," Tashunka finally said. The first words since they met, voice dry but not weak, strong like stone. She was 9. The silence after that wasn't silence. It was thunder held in the lungs. Jesse nodded once, slow, heavy. "I'm sorry." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Tashunka picked up the button, wrapped it again and tucked it back into his pouch. Then he looked Jesse in the eye and nodded. Not as an ally, not yet, but as a man who understood what it meant to carry a name and want it clean again. They didn't shake hands. Didn't need to. The next morning, before the sun even cracked the horizon, 2 horses rode out from the canyon, and in the dust behind them, 2 paths began to converge into a single path. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge. Sometimes it rides with a rifle and a scar. The desert doesn't forgive. It remembers. Every hoofprint, every lie, every blood stain too stubborn to fade. By the 3rd day on the trail, Jesse and Tashunka had stopped speaking again, not out of mistrust, but out of necessity. Words didn't hold up well under that sun. Water did. Instinct did. Silence kept them alive. They traveled narrow paths where the wind sounded like whispers, followed riverbeds long dry, where the bones of buffalo lay half-buried, cracked by time, and always the feeling that someone, or something, was just behind them, watching. Jesse felt it more at night, around the fire, when the horses shifted and the coyotes didn't sing. That was when the memories came. Not in dreams. Jesse didn't sleep long enough to dream, but in flashes. Vases, flames, the sound of galloping and screaming tangled together. He'd always thought ghosts belonged to the dead. Now he knew better. That night, they stopped near a bend in the rocks, a place where the cliffs broke into a hollow. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Tashunka started a fire with dried mesquite and silence. Jesse, as always, checked his weapons before eating, and then something changed. Tashunka tossed something onto the fire. It sparked green for a second, bitter smoke rising, a root Jesse didn't recognize. He looked over. Tashunka met his eyes. "My father used to burn this, said it showed the truth." Jesse raised an eyebrow. "Truth ain't never come out of smoke." Tashunka didn't argue, just stared into the flame, quiet, still. Jesse leaned back, watching, and then, like a dam breaking inside, he spoke. "You ever hear of Centralia?" Tashunka shook his head once. Jesse took a long breath. "Small town in Missouri, September '64. Me and Frank were riding with Bloody Bill. Ambushed a Union patrol on the rails. They were young, green. Some didn't even fight. We took the whole car, 40 men. He paused. The fire cracked. His jaw clenched. "Bill said they were spies, said we couldn't let 'em live. So we lined 'em up, shot 'em one by one, even after they begged." Tashunka's eyes didn't move. Jesse looked into the fire like it owed him an answer. 2 days later, I found a letter on one of 'em, addressed to his sister. Said he'd lied about his age to serve. 16, wanted to make his family proud. He shook his head. No one tells that part of the Jesse James story. Tashunka didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence wasn't judgment. It was reflection. Then he reached into his pouch, pulled something wrapped in cloth. Slowly he unfolded it. A piece of hide, old, stiff. On it, drawn in coal, a horse, a sun, and flames. "My village," he said. "I was 12. Jesse stared. No blinking, no pretending. Tashunka pointed to a mark near the corner, a circle with lines around it, like sun rays. That symbol was on their uniforms. Jesse leaned in, swallowed hard. It was the same mark etched into Barrett's map. Not just a military crest, a unit, one Jesse had heard whispered before. Company H, 4th Cavalry, Barrett's men. Jesse's voice dropped. He was there too. Tashunka nodded. There it was, the enemy, the man behind both their ghosts. They stared into the fire, not as strangers anymore, not as rivals, but as survivors of the same storm. The fire between them didn't feel like heat anymore. It felt like memory. Jesse reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin, opened it. Inside, 2 bullets, long, heavy, etched with marks. "This one," he said, pointing, "is for Barrett. Been carrying it for 9 years. He handed the second bullet to Tashunka. The Apache looked at it, then at Jesse. "I don't kill for others," Tashunka said. Jesse smiled faintly. "This one ain't for me, it's for her." Tashunka stared at the bullet. The flame reflected in his eyes. Then he wrapped it in cloth, tied it to his pouch, and nodded. They didn't speak again that night, but something unspoken had shifted. They weren't enemies around the fire anymore. They were brothers chasing a ghost. Neither of them could kill alone. And in the distance, the desert exhaled, as if it too was finally ready for the reckoning. They reached the old mission ruins just before sunset. Stone walls, half swallowed by the desert. Cracks like veins ran down every column. A bell tower leaned to one side, long since silent. There were no signs. No crosses, no names, just bones and shadow. But Jesse recognized the structure from Barrett's map. "This is it," he said, tying off his horse. Said he used it as a relay station. Supplies came in. Truth never came out. Tashunka moved without a word, stepping past. Broken pews and shattered glass. Something about the place smelled wrong, not of rot or death, but of time, the kind that decays memories into secrets. Inside, near the altar, was a wooden drum, not native, Spanish style, painted over. Used in ceremonies once, now half covered in dust and crow feathers. Jesse crouched beside it, ran his hand along the rim. Then he saw it, 3 small notches, uniform, spaced evenly. He took out his knife and gently pried off the skin top. Inside, papers, folded, dry, wrapped in cloth. He pulled them out slowly, carefully, like they might crumble if touched too fast. Tashunka watched as Jesse unwrapped the bundle. A map, letters, military orders, seals still intact. Jesse read aloud, voice tight. "Directive issued by Cole Josiah Barrett. Relocation of non-cooperative native groups to unmarked holding zones. Use of force permitted." He looked up. Relocation, that's what they called it. Tashunka didn't speak, but his hands clenched. Another letter, this one older, blood-stained. "Raid near Salt River successful. Minimal casualties on our side. Civilians neutralized. Assets secured. Commander James reported no resistance." Jesse froze. Commander James, not Jesse, his father. Tashunka stepped closer, reading the name. The realization hit him the same time it hit Jesse. It wasn't Jesse who had ridden with Barrett that day. It was his father, the preacher who'd gone west and never came back. Jesse sank onto a broken bench, shoulders heavy. "He never went looking for gold," he whispered. "He followed orders." The truth twisted inside him like barbed wire. His whole life, the war, the gang, the vengeance, all of it built on the ghost of a man who may have lit the first fire himself. Tashunka stared at the letter, then at Jesse. He expected anger, maybe shame, but Jesse just looked tired, like the weight had finally reached the bone. "There's more," Jesse said, turning to the last page. A ledger, names, codes, some crossed out, others circled, and one name at the bottom, marked with red ink. Tashunka, age 12, unconfirmed survivor. Jesse looked at him, voice low. They knew you lived." Tashunka's face didn't move, but his chest rose once sharply. Then he turned and walked out of the ruin. Jesse followed. Outside, the sun bled into the mountains, long shadows stretching like fingers across the sand. Tashunka stood by the edge of the cliff, arms crossed, staring out, wind in his hair, eyes locked on nothing. Jesse stopped beside him. "Barrett kept this stuff hidden for a reason. If it gets out..." Tashunka didn't wait for him to finish. "It won't bring them back. No, Jesse said, but it'll make sure they ain't forgotten. Tushunka turned, looked at Jesse for a long time. Then he nodded, slow, heavy, final. They buried the documents in a new pouch, wrapped tight in buffalo hide. Tomorrow they'd ride to Fort Verde, an old contact of Jesse's, someone who could get the truth into the right hands. But tonight they sat by a fire again. No stories, no ghosts, just the knowledge that the past wasn't gone. It had been waiting. Inside a drum, beneath an altar in a ruin, the desert tried to erase, and now it would rise, page by page. Fort Verde wasn't a fort anymore. It was a skeleton. A few buildings still stood, but most had been swallowed by dust and silence. The kind of place where history hangs in the air like smoke, but no one breathes it in. Jesse and Tushunka arrived at dawn. They didn't tie their horses to the post. They kept the reins in their hands, just in case. The man Jesse was looking for lived in a side house near the edge of the old barracks. He was retired Army, but not like Barrett. This one had served under fire and walked away with a limp and a conscience. Name was Callahan. He opened the door before Jesse could knock. Grey hair, cane, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I heard you were dead," he said. Jesse grinned. "Feels that way most days." Callahan looked past him to Tushunka, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, just nodded once, slow, not in greeting, but in recognition. They sat at a rough-hewn table. Jesse unwrapped the pouch and spread the papers. Letters, orders, the ledger. Callahan didn't flinch as he read them. When he reached the name Tushunka, he stopped. "I was there," he said quietly. "Not in the village, but I was with the 4th. We heard the rumors, whole units disappearing, orders that changed after the fact. Barrett had his own trail, no oversight, no one dared question him." He leaned back, eyes distant. "I tried once, sent a letter to the War Office. Next week I was reassigned to the Dakota front. 5 of my men never made it home." Jesse tapped the ledger. "This proves he used federal routes to hide relocations, used the church as a waypoint. If this gets to the right paper, he burns." Callahan looked at him, then at Tushunka. "He won't burn," he said. "He'll vanish. A man like Barrett doesn't face justice. He erases it." Tushunka finally spoke. "Then we don't give him the chance." There was steel in his voice, cold, forged over years. Jesse stood. "We need to find him before this disappears again." Callahan hesitated, then limped over to a small chest and pulled out an old journal, opened it to a map. Ink faded, corners curled. "He owns land now, private, eastern New Mexico, protected by federal silence. I marked it years ago. Figured someone would come looking one day." He handed it to Jesse. "I guess that someone's you." Outside, the sun had started to climb, but Jesse didn't feel warm. He felt settled, like something that had been waiting inside him had finally woken up. He shook Callahan's hand. Tushunka nodded once in thanks. Before they left, Callahan added one more thing. "You know what happens when you cut off the head, right?" Jesse looked back. "The body rots." "No," Callahan said, voice quiet. "Another one grows." Jesse nodded. "Then we'll be there for that one too." They rode out before noon, toward New Mexico, toward Barrett, not as outlaw and warrior, but as witnesses, carrying not just proof, but purpose. And the war that had never truly ended was about to be dragged into the light. New Mexico didn't welcome them. It swallowed them. The trail wound through canyons that whispered like the dead, over plains where bones turned white under endless sun. Jesse and Tushunka spoke little now. The time for words had passed. What lay ahead wasn't for talking. It was for settling. The map from Callahan had led them to a stretch of land near Chama. No towns, no law, just a patch of scorched ground behind a ridge, surrounded by barbed wire and silence. On paper, it was a livestock station, but Jesse had seen the signs before, the kind no livestock ever touched, hidden trails, armed guards, eyes behind every door. That night, they watched from the ridge. 4 men, armed, no uniforms, mercenaries, hired silence. A large shed near the back, reinforced. Jesse spotted fresh tracks leading in and out, supplies, crates, but one different, longer, older, dragged in, not carried. "That's where it is," Jesse said low. "That's where he's hid it." Tushunka scanned the perimeter, then motioned to the west side, weakest point, unwatched. At dusk, the sun would be in the guards' eyes. If they moved fast, clean, they could be inside before anyone knew what hit them. but Jesse knew better. Even if we find it, he'll come. Barrett ain't the kind to let his gold walk away. Tushunka checked his rifle, calm, focused. Then we let him come. The next day they struck, not with a shootout, not with a blaze, but with silence. Just before sunset, they slipped through. The wire, 2 guards at the edge, neutralized with blades, the rest distracted by dust storms rolling in from the west. Inside the shed, crates, sealed, government markings half scratched out. Jesse broke one open, gold bars, stamped U.S. Treasury, some dated 1864, others earlier, stolen during transfers, redirected by false orders. It wasn't just loot, it was history, robbed, buried, silenced. And beside the gold, another box, smaller, locked. Jesse broke it with his knife. Inside, photographs, letters, documents bearing Barrett's signature, proof of payouts, bribes, operations disguised as settlements. And then, a journal. Jesse opened it. Barrett's handwriting, tight, precise. They think it's over, but war isn't fought with bullets anymore. It's fought with memory, and mine will last longer than theirs. Tushunka looked at him. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about legacy, control of the story. Barrett hadn't just buried treasure, he'd buried the truth. And now Jesse and Tushunka were standing in the middle of it, but they weren't alone. Outside, voices, shouts. The alarm had been raised. Jesse grabbed the journal. Tushunka took the photos. Then came the gunfire. The door exploded in. Bullets tore through crates. Jesse ducked, fired twice. 2 men down. Tushunka dropped a third with one shot. No hesitation. Then came the voice from outside. Cold, clear. James, Apache, I should have known. Barrett, older now, but the voice still held steel. Jesse stepped into the doorway. No more hiding, he said. Barrett stared at him from across the dust, flanked by 4 more men, dressed in white, clean, not soldiers, strategists. You think this changes anything? Barrett asked. Truth is what survives. You're a footnote. Tushunka appeared beside Jesse, raised his rifle. Then here's your last chapter, he said, and fired. The shot rang out like thunder across dry stone. Barrett fell backward, clutching his shoulder, not dead, but wounded. His men scattered, firing wild, caught off guard by the precision of Tushunka's strike. Jesse moved fast. 1 bullet dropped the nearest gunman. Another went through a crate, exploding wood and dust. Then the desert woke. From the cliffs, 3 more shadows appeared. Riders, silent, methodical, long rifles. Not Barrett's men, not Jesse's. Forgotten faces. Apache. Tushunka didn't blink. He'd sent a message 2 days ago, hidden in fire, smoke, and ashes. A code only his people would understand. He hadn't known if it would work, but it had. They came not as warriors of vengeance, but as guardians of memory, elders and sons of men buried under Barrett's orders. They had followed the whispers, the tracks, the smell of deceit carried by the wind, and now they had come to finish it. The compound turned to chaos. Gunfire echoed like drums. Jesse ducked behind the shed, covering Tushunka as he flanked the eastern wall. One of Barrett's men tried to run, a young one too green to be that dangerous. Jesse hesitated, then lowered his weapon. The kid dropped his rifle and ran. Jesse let him go. He was done adding ghosts. Tushunka reached Barrett, now crawling toward a saddlebag near the barn. Another pistol maybe, another lie. Too slow. Tushunka kicked the weapon away and leveled his rifle, but he didn't fire. Barrett looked up, blood on his lips. You think this matters? They'll bury it, just like they buried yours. Tushunka knelt beside him, eyes hard, voice even. We won't let them. Barrett laughed, choking. You don't have a country. Tushunka leaned closer. No, but I have a name. Then he stood and walked away. He didn't need to pull the trigger. Barrett was already finished, the kind of man history only remembered when someone forced it to. Behind him, Jesse walked out with the ledger, the gold journal, and the box of photographs. One Apache elder, face carved by years and dust, nodded toward the sky. Let the wind carry what matters. That night, they burned the false orders, the bribes, the forged names, but not all of it. The journal, the ledger, the evidence, that stayed. Not for revenge, for history. And when the sun rose the next morning, the compound was empty, except for the sound of wind and peace. They found him in Santa Fe, old, blind in one eye, wrapped in medals he hadn't earned. General Amos Klein. He'd been Barrett's superior, at least on paper, but Jesse knew how war worked. Rank didn't always mean power. Sometimes it meant distance, plausible denial, but Klein had signed the orders. His name was on the relocation acts. His seal stamped the lies. They walked into the veteran's home without disguises. Jesse wore dust like a badge. Tashunka walked behind him, silent as always, but every step radiating truth. An aide tried to stop them. Jesse showed the ledger. That was enough. Klein sat near a window, listening to a radio hum a war ballad from a war he hadn't fought. When he turned, Jesse saw it in his face. Not fear, but recognition. "You came late," the general rasped. Tashunka stepped forward. "But we came," Klein coughed. A rattle from deep inside. He pointed to a chair. "You want to hear the truth, or you want me to say I'm sorry?" Jesse didn't sit. "Start with the part where you buried villages." Klein stared through him. "We didn't bury them. We moved them." Tashunka's fists tightened. "You burned them," he said. Klein didn't argue. "You don't understand," he muttered. "After the war, there was no plan. The government wanted silence. They wanted the railroad built, the borders cleaned up, no press, no delays. The tribes weren't resistance. They were obstacles, so they made them disappear." He looked at Jesse. "You ever try to keep a country together with no glue?" Jesse stepped closer. "My mother lost her hand. My brother nearly died. You think that was glue?" Klein didn't flinch. "Collateral." Tashunka moved like a storm. In one blink he was inches from Klein, the journal in hand. "You see this?" he hissed. "Your legacy." He threw the journal on the old man's lap. Klein opened it with shaking fingers. He didn't deny a word. "I gave the orders," he said. "But Barrett, he chose how to carry them out." He pointed to a line in the journal. "Necessary force." That was the phrase. Gave him a blank check. He filled it in blood. Jesse crossed his arms. "So why'd you hide it?" Klein looked tired, ancient. "Because no one wanted to read it." He nodded toward the window, to a country rebuilding itself on the backs of broken promises. "They want cowboys and outlaws, not orphans and ruins. They'll remember you as a killer before they admit I was one." Tashunka turned to Jesse. "This won't be printed. Not like we think." Jesse nodded. "No, but it'll be heard." He leaned down, voice low. "One day soon you'll be gone, and the wind'll carry what you said, but the page'll carry what you did." Klein closed his eyes. "I never hated you people," he said almost to himself. Tashunka stepped back. "We didn't need your hate," he said. "Your silence was enough." They left him with the journal, not out of mercy, but as a mirror. Outside, the sky was heavy with storm clouds. Truth had been spoken, but justice was still out there, riding. They met just before the border. A river ran shallow between the cliffs, not enough to drink, just enough to mark a line between states, between wars, between the past and what might come next. Jesse sat on a rock, rolling a bullet between his fingers. Not the one for Barrett. That one had already been used. This was the second one, the one he'd given to Tashunka by the fire. Tashunka stood on the other side of the river, holding it, not offering it back, not throwing it away, just holding it. Between them, silence again, but this time it was peace. They had done what they came to do. Barrett was gone. The gold would never see circulation. The journal, copies of it, were already in the hands of Callahan and others who wouldn't let it vanish. The truth, at last, had teeth. But Jesse knew something that Tashunka hadn't said. This wasn't over. Tashunka finally broke the silence. "I'm going." "North," he said. Jesse raised a brow. "Canada?" Tashunka nodded. "There's land there, old kin. A place without wires, without maps." Jesse smirked. "Sounds too quiet for you." Tashunka looked at the river. "I'm done chasing ghosts." A pause. "Are you?" Jesse looked down at the bullet in his hand. "The last one." "I don't know," he said. "Some ghosts don't like to stay buried." He looked up, serious now. "But if they come back, I won't run." Tashunka nodded. "Neither will I." Then he stepped forward and dropped the bullet into the river. Not as a weapon, as a burial, the final one. Jesse stood, walked to the edge of the water, looked across. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, but in that glance, that still, narrow moment, something passed between them. A truce, not signed, not sealed, just lived. Tashunka turned and walked north, Jesse south. The river kept flowing, and somewhere behind them, the past finally began to rest. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, no sender's name, just a rough envelope, stained at the edges, folded twice like it had crossed 1,000 miles in someone's coat pocket. It landed on the wooden counter of a small post house outside Kansas City. The clerk called out, "James?" Jesse looked up from his seat, boots dusty, a half-finished coffee cooling beside him. He hadn't heard that name in a while, not from a stranger. He walked over, took the envelope and turned it in. His hand, inside, a note, a single line. "They found the boy's grave. Come if you want to know." There was no signature, but Jesse recognized the handwriting. Frank's. The name hit harder than a bullet. Frank hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since the gang split after the Northfield job, not since Jesse had turned away from the path they'd built in blood. But if Frank was calling now, it meant something was unfinished. Jesse saddled up before dawn, didn't tell anyone, and didn't leave word, just rode, like he always had, into the wind, toward the place where the map ended and the questions began. It took 3 days to reach the hill, a quiet patch of land outside Liberty, Missouri, unmarked on most charts, forgotten by locals. But Jesse remembered it. They used to camp there as boys, hide from the world, pretend they were soldiers before they ever held real guns. Frank was already there, older, thinner, but the eyes were the same, sharp, tired, watching everything. He didn't speak right away, just pointed to the ground. There, under an oak tree, was a small wooden cross, weathered, simple. Jesse knelt. There was a carving, barely visible. AJ, age 10. He felt his stomach twist. Frank knelt beside him. "Remember that farmhouse we hit near Lawrence?" he asked. Jesse nodded slowly. "The one with the red fence. There was a boy," Frank said, "hid in the hayloft. We never saw him, but his father," he begged. Jesse's throat tightened. "I never thought he was serious," Frank said. "Thought it was just a trick." "He wasn't," Jesse whispered. Frank handed him a small, rusted tin. "Someone found it buried in the ashes last month. Had his name, his drawings, a note to his mother." Jesse opened it. Inside, a scrap of cloth, a piece of carved wood, a child's handwriting. "I heard them coming. I'm scared. Tell Mama I tried to be brave." The words hit like thunder in Jesse's chest. He stood, looked at Frank. "I didn't know." "I know," Frank said, "but that doesn't matter now." Jesse walked to the tree, took off his hat, and stood still for a long time, long enough for the wind to shift, for the silence to become something sacred. Then he said 3 words. "I remember him." That night, Jesse lit no fire. He sat by the grave, alone, watching the stars shift. Because sometimes justice isn't about what you do. Sometimes it's about carrying what you cannot fix. Years passed. The world moved on. The trains ran louder. The towns grew taller. The law wore newer boots. But the stories never stopped. Not in the saloons. Not in the letters passed from hand to hand. Not in the silence between old soldiers at the edge of town. Some said Jesse James vanished. Some swore he was killed by a coward in St. Joseph. Others claimed they saw him riding through Texas long after that. But there was one story, quiet, almost forgotten, that only a few ever heard. A story about a rider who came alone to a narrow ridge in Arizona long after the wars were done. He brought no gang, no guns, just a bundle wrapped in leather and a name on his lips. The ridge hadn't changed. Same dust, same wind, same canyon that had once held 2 men staring death in the eye. There, at the highest point, Jesse dug with his bare hands. Not deep, just enough. Inside the bundle, the copy of Barrett's journal, wrapped in cloth and smoke-stained. Memories, a single silver button, a faded photograph of a child's carved toy, and 2 tokens placed side by side, a cross and an arrow. He didn't say much, didn't need to, just whispered something the wind caught and carried. Then he buried them all, not to hide, but to leave them, for whoever came next, for whoever needed to know the truth had lived and been laid to rest. He stood there a while longer, watching the shadows stretch. Then he turned, mounted up, and rode west. Not fast, not chased, just onward. Some say Jesse James died the way they tell in the papers, shot in the back, betrayed, forgotten. But those who truly listened, who sat with the elders, who walked the ruins, who heard the wind speak through burned stones, they tell it different. They say he left behind a truth no bullet could bury. They say the cross and the arrow still lie where he placed them. And if you ever find them, don't touch. Just listen, because some stories ain't meant to end. They're meant to echo forever. If this story stirred something in you, if at any point you felt the weight of truth, of loss, or of memory, then subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories that don't fit in headlines, stories that carry scars, forgotten names, and silences that still scream. Turn on the notifications, because some truths still need to be told.